time. The meeting kind of ended abruptly. But I remembered she was writing a book about Placer County. And since we're trying to bring in different speakers from all our area and all around us, I thought this would be a good opportunity. So as you can see, her name is Christina Richter. And she is with the Placer County Historical Advisory Board. She's worked with a lot of museums. So she's got a lot of experience, and so we're really lucky to have her. And as you notice, she is also an author and has written a couple of books that are available here locally. So we appreciate her coming out this evening and sharing the Donner Party and its relationship to some people that were in the Fiddyment family. And probably all of you have heard about the Fiddyment family in Roseville. Now it's becoming houses, what their ranch used to be. But, so Christina, welcome, and we're looking forward to talking to you.
Thank you, Kay. Thank you. Have any of you seen a Donner presentation before? Okay, a few of you. Oh, more than just a few, that's what I thought. Are any of you, do any of you consider yourselves experts in the Donner situation? Okay, that's good, because there's a lot of information out there. I have to say that this topic in history has probably been covered more than most other topics, right? Because it was sensationalized, and what happened was quite the tragedy, and they took the wrong route, and they did all the things. And you can go to a presentation that tells you the route that they took and why they made the wrong turn and the decisions that they made. But I do this from a different perspective, and I do it because I did write a book with David Fiddyment. It came out in 2013. And it's called Walk With Me, I Want to Tell You Something, the story of the Fiddyment family. And David and I worked on this for 7 years at least. His wife Dolly kept pulling letters out of her closet from ancestors that she wanted me to review. But David liked to talk about the Donners because his great-great-great aunt was Tamsin Donner. And he had a lot of information that had been passed down in his family. The biggest thing was, in David's view, was the children and their perspective and how they got through the tragedy. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the actual journey, and we're going to show you where they made the wrong turn and all of that. But I'm going to also share with you the children's perspective. So let's go ahead and get started. I like you to watch the screen, not me. So I'm going to sit over here, put my glasses on. And I also am real fine with interactive. Can you all see it? Is the light in the way? Should we turn off the lights up here, or are we good?
Good to me.
Can't get much lower.
Okay, well then let's take it away. I am in contract right now with Arcadia Publishing with a co-author for Hidden History of Placer County. So I love history, and I love talking about it. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do in our community, and thank you to each and every one of you for what you do for history, because this is our foundation. If we forget our history, we forget who we are. So let's just go ahead and dig right in. I call this the Vale of the Great Storm King because one of the ancestors did call it the Great Storm King. And this story, like I said, it's been analyzed and retold just hundreds and hundreds of times. But I want to humanize the experience a little bit and also share some of the events through the eyes of the children, especially Eliza Donner. So we talk about this particular thing that happened in history. And here's a quote I want to give you. And think about that in terms of today's events too, or what happened with COVID a few years ago. When an anomaly occurs, an aberration, something so extremely out of the ordinary, then a veil descends, and behavior is no longer normal. We see that, right? And that's exactly what happened with these pioneers. So how did it all start? You guys, have you seen this painting before? Many people know it as Manifest Destiny, but the actual name of it is American Progress. Anybody know the artist? The artist was John Gast. And this is a painting of Columbia. And if you see Columbia, let me see if my pointer, does my pointer work? Oh, yay. Okay, so you see what she's doing. She's coming from the east. See how light it is? And she's going into the darkness of the west because she's driving people in to make it civilized. She's taking with her books in her right hand because that's education and enlightenment. And then in her left hand here, she's pulling the telegraph wire. That's communication, that's technology, that's advancing. So this feeling of manifest destiny was our God-given right to explore the lands and settle and develop them. Because before 1845, there were primarily fur trappers and traders west of the Mississippi. I don't know if you had those here in Orangevale or not, but you probably did. Our first parties here were the Bidwells. Anybody familiar with the Bidwell mansion that just burned down in Chico? That was horrible. That was an arsonist thing. They came in 1841. And then in 1844, the Stevens Murphy Townsend party. People don't realize that there were people before the Donners. And then, of course, Fremont and Carson's Pass. He also came over in 1844, and he was a mountain man. So we had a lot of Native Americans here. And then, of course, just a reminder, about 10 years earlier, our missions were all up and down the coast of California. This is way back in history here. So what was going on back east? Well, we're talking about immigrants. And in the winter of 1845, people really wanted to go to the west because it was getting a great population. Let's expand. So at the Donner home, people would gather every week and they'd bring things for people to review, old letters from traders and trappers, everybody who had been on the Pacific coast, not a whole lot, but there was some information. Tamsen Donner, she was well educated. Unlike many of her friends and a great many of her family, she could read and she could write and she could communicate. So they would bring her these articles and she would read these publications out loud to the group. And of course, the two most popular works were this Hastings book, The Immigrant Guide to Oregon and California, which, by the way, talks about his cutoff in about a paragraph. The rest of it is all good, and it's all about going to Oregon and the West, and just about a paragraph about the cutoff. So George Donner and his brother Jacob, they're like, let's go. Let's make this happen. So they take out an ad. Of course, it doesn't look like this, but this is a reproduction of it. But it just, it's interesting. Who wants to go to California without it costing them anything? Now, that's irony, if I've ever seen it. And then he goes on to ask about 8 young men of good character who can drive an ox team, etc., etc., etc. And this was placed in the Springfield Journal March 18th, 1846. But along with this ad, there were articles and editorials about the West and how important it was to get out there and how great it would be to start your family all over again. Notices of companies also were starting to form. And then a gentleman by the name of James Reed became interested at about this point. So preparations began, and they're ready to go. Here are the folks in this particular party. They do join a larger party, but these are the core folks. So you've got George and Tamsen, and they've got 5 children in tow. Then you've got Jacob and Elizabeth, and they have 7 children in tow. And then you have James Reed and his wife, Margaret. They have 5 children, and his grandmother, Sarah Keyes, does not want to be left behind. So James builds a double-decker wagon for her, and she ends up actually dying on the trail. But he did try to make her as comfortable as possible. And they brought servants. So including Teamsters in all, there were about 35 people who began the journey. And they called it the Reed Donner Party, and then of course it was the larger group was called the Boggs Party. But one of the girls writes, as time went on, our preparations were frequently interrupted by social obligations, farewell visits, dinners, and other merrymakings with friends and kindred far away, far and near. Thursday, April 15th, 1846 was a day fixed for our departure, and the members of our household were at work before the rosy dawn. We children were dressed early, and as the final packing progressed, we often peeped out of the window at the 3 big white-covered wagons that stood in our yard. Roughly looks like this. Obviously, it's a recreation, but you get the general idea. And those 3 wagons had 3 distinct purposes. The first one was they just stored merchandise and articles that wouldn't be taken out until they got to California. The second one were their provisions, clothing, camp tools, and anything for camping. And then third was their family home on wheels with the feed boxes attached to the back for the horses. So the first 2 wagons left early in the day, each drawn by 3 yoke of powerful oxen whose great moist eyes looked as though they too had parting tears to shed. The loose cattle quickly followed. At noon, the family wagon was ready. Then came a pause fraught with anguish to the dear ones gathered about the homestead to say farewell. Each tried to be courageous, but not one was so brave as Father when he bade goodbye to his friends, to his children from a prior marriage. George Donner was married before, and to his children's children. So this is a grandfather as well. I sat beside my mother with my hand clasped in hers as we slowly moved away from that quaint old house. As I glanced up, I saw tears in her eyes and sorrow in her face. I was grieved at her pain and in sympathy, nestled closer and soon fell asleep. So here's our timeline. Everything's going just great. April, they leave Springfield, they get to Independence May 10th. They're 100 miles west of Independence on May 19th, and they join the larger party and become the Boggs Party. And then they reach Fort Laramie July 4th, but in between May and July, Tamsen writes back, and they're about 200 miles from Fort Laramie. There's 518 wagons, including the 40 in the Donner Party. And she's writing to her family saying it's no big deal. We don't have any wood, so we burn buffalo chips. But we're going to be just fine, basically. You can read effectively what she's saying here. I'm going to jump down to a little bit below the middle. Tomorrow we cross the river, and by reckoning, we'll be over 200 miles from Fort Laramie, where we intend to stop and repair our wagon wheels. Now, this is interesting. They are nearly all loose, and I am afraid we will have to stop sooner if there can be found wood suitable to heat the tires. So they have to heat those metal tires and repair them that way by making them bendable. There is no wood here, and our women and children are out now gathering buffalo chips to burn in order to do the cooking. These chips burn well. Of course, we've all heard that before. So here's the trail. And it's going along just well. And here's their timeline. They leave Independence. They get to Fort Laramie. Now, Bridger's Fort, that's where they start making some important decisions. Fort Hall was another stop up there a little bit north of Bridger's Fort, but they're down in Bridger's Fort, and they're right before the Great Salt Lake. So while they're at Fort Laramie, James Reed meets an old friend. His name is James Kleiman. And he's an old mountaineer, and he's just come by horse from California with Lansford Hastings by way of a new route. The new route, they say, will eventually be called Hastings Cutoff, and Kleiman warns the immigrants to avoid Hastings Cutoff, though, and to take the regular route instead. So the party stays, and they stay at Fort Laramie. They celebrate the 4th of July, and then they have to figure out which way they're going. So as a side note, we think that Hastings was probably employed by Sutter. And what did Sutter want to do? He wanted to develop and build his little empire out here. And so Hastings reportedly was paid by Sutter to get people out here as best he could. So I'm going to show you where Hastings Cutoff is. You can see my little arrow going. So they're down here, and they're trying to figure out which way they're going. So 5 days later, the Donner Party reaches Fort Bridger, expecting to meet Hastings, but they were informed by Hastings' agent that he had gone forward to pilot another large immigrant train. But Hastings left instructions that all arrivals should follow his trail. He said they would find, quote, an abundant supply of wood, water, and pasturage along the whole line or road, except for a stretch of 30 or 40 miles at most that was a dry drive. The party stays 4 days to rest their oxen, and on July 31st, James Reed writes, Hastings Cutoff is said to be a saving of 350 or 400 miles and a better route. The rest of the Californians went the long route and feeling afraid of Hastings Cutoff. But Mr. Bridger informs me that it is a fine, level road with plenty of water and grass, and he estimated it would take them about 7 weeks to reach Sutter's Fort. So they think they're going to reach Sutter's Fort mid-September. Well, they had some issues. They hit the Great Salt Lake, and they had been 30 days in reaching the Great Salt Lake. And it was originally estimated that it would take about 10 or 12 days. So at that point, James Reed and 2 others, they ride ahead of the group to catch up with Hastings with the intention of bringing him back and making him show them exactly where they're going to go. But he slips out of the reach of them and he says, I'm not going to return with you, but let me point out a part of a canyon to get you through. So one of the girls writes, sudden fear of being lost in the trackless mountains almost precipitated a panic. And it was with difficulty that my father and other cool-headed persons kept excited families from scattering rashly into greater dangers. So on August 11th, Reed has returned to the party and they set out on the new route. And they're literally chopping a road through the brush and the trees of the Wasatch Mountains. So here's a note from Hastings that they find along the way. And he writes, 2 days, 2 nights, hard driving, cross desert, reach water. This would be a heavy strain on our cattle. They were granted 36 hours indulgence near bubbling waters amid good pasturage. They figured they were only going to be delayed 2, maybe 3 days. They left camp on the morning of September 9 and entered the quote-unquote dry drive. And remember, Hastings and his agent at Fort Bridger had represented it at 35 or 40 miles. Well, this is what that looks like today. That's what they had to cross. And it was a region of fearful desolation. So once again, James Reed rides ahead to prospect for water, and all who could walk did so. It took them 6 days, and they lost 36 head of cattle. One of the diaries exclaimed, husbands bowed their heads, appalled at the situation of their families, and they cursed Hastings. It was clear they could not turn back. This was probably taken in the 20s or 30s, and people found artifacts along this route that the Donners had taken for years and years of things that they had jettisoned along the way. Another issue that they had were, of course, the Indians. Once they crossed the desert, they found good traveling, but the spirits were really, really low, and the Indians were threatening their campsites each night, and any loose cattle was always at risk for being stolen. And it was plain that the hardships and misfortunes of the journey had sharpened tempers. On October 5th, the party was beginning to descent, and that morning, cattle became mixed up when 2 wagons were starting their teams to escape the Indians, and both drivers were provoked. Reed was one driver, Snyder the other, and Snyder began to whip Reed and hit his wife in the process. Well, that didn't sit well with Reed at all, and he instantly responded by stabbing Snyder, and he killed him. And at that point, Reed was banished from the group. So, depending upon what you read and which history recollection that you read, I like to think that the one that's true is that, they banished Reed without weapons or food or anything, but the story goes that his daughter snuck some food to him and a couple of weapons, so he wasn't completely naked out there in the wilderness. It was plain that the hardships and misfortunes of the journey had sharpened tempers, both men, and the vexations of the morning had been too much for the overstrained nerves. So the party finally reaches the Truckee River on October 16th. And Eliza writes in her book, the weather was already very cold, and the heavy clouds were hanging over the mountains to the west, and they were strong indicators of an approaching winter. Some wanted to stop and rest their cattle, and others, in fear of the snow, were in favor of pushing ahead as fast as possible. So on October 19th, Charles Stanton, now he's this young guy, 35 years old, he's a bachelor, he had joined them to be part of the party to come west. He had ridden ahead, and he wanted to get provisions from Sutter's Fort, and he did so. And he returned from Sutter's Fort with new provisions on 7 mules. So those were quite a few provisions. He said the pass through the Sierra should be open for another month. And again, that's October 19th. Their arrival is met with great joy, so their spirits are starting to lift again. And after a brief consultation with my father, Stanton and his Indians, Stanton had hired 2 Indians to go with him, distribute first in those most of need of provisions. Then they broke camp on the 22nd and crossed the Truckee River. So on October 31st, this is when real trouble starts. During the trip, an axle on a Donner Party wagon broke, and it nearly killed Eliza. She's 3 or 4 years old at this point, and she's thrown into the river, and they have to rescue this little baby out of the river. In attempting the repairs to the wagon, George Donner basically receives a severe blow to his hand. So he takes this blunt instrument, and he accidentally hits his hand, and it's a problem. It's a real problem. It eventually kills him, as we know. So the Donner wagons, because of George's accident, are behind the Breen family wagons. And October 31st, the Breen family reaches the Truckee Lake at night, and during the night it begins snowing on the summit. Word reaches the Donners that snow has begun to fall. Quote unquote, it was a terrible piece of news. The Donners tried to hurry to join the others, but then they get stuck, and they're 5 miles from them on a place called Alder Creek. And Eliza shares in her book, typical of a child, no one observed the picturesque grandeur of the forest-covered mountains, nor that eastward and southward it looks out across plateaus to the Washoe Mountains 20 miles away. A piercing wind was driving storm clouds toward us, and those who understood their threatening aspect realized that 21 persons, 8 of them helpless children, were there at the mercy of the pitiless Storm King. So this particular illustration, if any of you have seen this before, it's kind of famous, has been debunked. It was absolutely not real. It kind of looks like it's a new settlement with new trees growing up and nice, neat cabins. It wasn't like this at all, but you get an idea. The camp at Donner Lake, November 1846. So this is an artist rendering. And they attempted to make it over the pass, all of them, but then they found 5 to 10 foot drifts of snow. They couldn't locate the trail. They turned back to Truckee Lake, which is now Donner Lake, and within a day, all the families except for the Donners were camped there except for the Donners, who were 5 miles, half a day's journey below them. On the evening of November 4th, it began to snow again. And at Truckee Lake, 60 members and associates of the Breen, Graves, Reed, Murphy, Keysburg actually, and Eddy families set up for the winter. There were 3 separate cabins of pine logs with dirt floors and poorly constructed flat roofs that leaked when it rained. This served as their homes. So here is a very rudimentary drawing. The Donner camp is up here on Alder Creek. The Graves Reed cabin is here. The Breen cabin is here. This is the Murphy cabin. Has anyone been to the Donner Visitor Center? Seen that? It's a great illustration of basically what they went through, and there's outside they have where the cabins are or were, and they have done a lot of excavating there as well, which is very interesting. At the Donners camp, Eliza writes, the snow was falling faster and in larger flakes. It made pictures for Georgia and me upon the branches of big and little trees. It nestled in piles upon our buffalo robe. Everything within our quarters was cold, damp, and dreary, until our tired mother and elder sisters built the fire, prepared our supper, and sent us to bed, each with a lump of sugar as comfort. So it was a full day's travel on foot between these two camps, and they would send letters to each other by way of designated messengers. So the youngest of the men, young boys or older boys, if you will, would go back and forth between the camps with these notes. They made several attempts to cross the summit. None succeeded. You all have heard the forlorn hope and all of those stories. I skip over those because we don't have enough time to go into those details, but they're pretty fascinating too. On December 17th, 17 people attempt to cross the summit. They arrive at an Indian village on January 12th, and nearly half of them died in the attempt. And that's all I'll say about that. On January 10th, big news happened. The Mexican-American War in California is over. So now men and supplies are freed for a rescue attempt. So prior to this time, the men couldn't get to them because they were tied up with this war going on. So here's something that happened in the San Francisco newspaper. Of course, at the time it was called Yerba Buena. And this is pretty fascinating. A company of 20 men left here on Sunday last for the California mountains with provisions, clothing, etc., for the suffering immigrants now there. The citizens of this place subscribed about $1,500 for their relief, so they actually raised money for their relief, which was expended for such articles as the immigrants would be most likely to need. Mr. Greenwood, an old mountaineer, anybody heard of Caleb Greenwood? Yeah, sure. Out in Tahoe, they think they have a Greenwood golf course and lots of Greenwood things there. An old mountaineer went with the company as a pilot. If it is possible to cross the mountains, they will get to the immigrants in time to save them. This is February 6th, 1847. So here we have the same image, and the relief party is above the snow, and everybody's buried under the snow in their three huts. The lake is completely frozen and snowed over, and they estimated that the snow was about 13 feet deep. So Eliza, in her memoirs, recalls, "Oh, how we watched hour after hour with straining eyes, scanning the desolate expanse for one moving speck in the distance, which should ease our awful suspense." So that first relief party reaches the lake on February 18th, and Eliza writes, "It was a long, weary waiting on starvation rations until the 19th of February. I did not see anyone coming that morning, but I remember that, suddenly, there was an unusual stir and excitement in the camp. 3 strangers were there, and one was talking with Father. The others took packs from their backs and measured out small quantities of flour and jerked beef and 2 small biscuits for each of us. Elitha and Leanna came and kissed me, then another goodbye, and went up the steps and out of sight. Mother stood in the snow where she could see all go forth. Leanna, the last in line, was scarcely able to keep up." So going forward, 41 total died in the mountains, 48 survived, and interesting, 2/3 of the women and children survived. And the reason why women last longer in the wilderness, anybody know? We have an extra layer of fat. All 4 Donner adults died. Most of the Reeds and all of the Breens survived. And then the Donner children are all taken to Sutter's Fort. So the third relief arrives on March 13th. They've rescued 4 people, and all but Tamsin and George and Keysburg leave. So Tamsin's there because George can't travel. He's ailing. He's clearly not going to make it, and Tamsin refuses to leave him. She keeps her wedding vows till the end. And of course, once he passes away, she wraps him. He's in very immaculate he's clothed immaculately. He's wrapped in a sheet. And when they find him, he's in basically in good shape, not just scattered about. but Keysburg is still there. So there's a lot of stories about how Tamsin died. Did she die by maybe falling in a creek on her way to the Keysburg cabin? Did he actually cannibalize her? We're not really sure. Keysburg, in a later meeting with Eliza, swore to her that he did not cannibalize her mother. But he also was known not to tell the truth a lot as well. So we'll never know that. So April 17th, the fourth relief arrives, and Keysburg is the only one left alive. Now, they were also looking for money. A lot of them were vigilantes going up there, and they wanted to know where the Donner's money was. And Keysburg knew, but he wouldn't tell them. So they got it out of him. And we won't go into detail about how they did, but they got it out of him. They took the money, and unfortunately, the children never saw that money. It was buried apparently under a tree. They also say that some of the money from the Donners was in a quilt, that Tamsin had sewn it into a quilt, and probably that went up in flames when they later came through and burned everything. Oh, let's see here. June 22nd was the last. 1847, General Stephen Watts Kearney, who was heading east with the Mormon Battalion, they stopped at the camp, they gathered everything at all the lake cabins and the Breen cabin, and they burnt it and buried any of the bodies that were not buried. So they pretty well cleaned it up. So the girls get to Sutter's Fort. Wow, what a relief. And they think Tamsin, their mom, is going to join them. And they're hopeful that their father will too, but they definitely expect their mom to show up. So Eliza writes, "Neither fear nor misgivings troubled us little ones the morning we started out, hand in hand, to explore our new surroundings. We had rested, been washed, combed and fed, and we believed that father and mother would soon come to us. Often we looked at each other and exclaimed, 'How good it is to be here instead of up in the snow.' The women in the fort fed them. They fed them bread and other things as they could. So they were fairly well taken care of, and Sutter gave them little private quarters to live in as well." Okay, I think I'm missing a slide. No, I'm not. Here we go. Here's the rest of this. So they're there, they're getting settled, they're fed, they're waiting. In May, a party arrived at the fort with horses laden with many packs of goods, but their only refugee was Louis Keysburg. That evening, someone came to our door and spoke to Elitha and Leanna in low tones and went away. My sisters turned, put their arms about us, and wept bitterly. The cruel, desolating truth was told. No weary waiting would ever bring father and mother to us again. So a few months later, Elitha Donner marries a guy by the name of Perry McCoon, and she leaves the fort with him. So a list of the survivors and those who have died reaches the East Coast. And so the family of the Donners are getting pretty concerned. Now keep in mind, communication takes a long time back in the 1840s, and they hadn't heard from anybody from the West, and the West hadn't heard from anybody from the East. So there's word in the East that the cousins have lived, but no one knows exactly where they are. Well, it turns out that there was a woman by the name of Grandma Bruner, and she took in the two of the youngest Donner girls. They called her Grandma, and this picture was probably about 1850. In early summer of 1849, word from the family in the East had finally reached the girls, and Eliza writes, "One day, the San Francisco postmaster forwarded a letter addressed to ex-Governor Boggs. Governor Boggs personally brought the letter to Mrs. Bruner. We did not understand all it said, but enough to know that it had been written by our own dear Aunt Elizabeth, who wanted Governor Boggs to find her sisters, 3 little orphaned girls, and send them back to her by ship to Massachusetts." Can you imagine putting 3 little children on a ship to go back to Massachusetts after everything that they had been through? Mrs. Brunner explained to the ex-governor that we did not want to leave her, nor would she give us up. She said she and her husband had befriended us when we were poor and useless. The governor then promised to explain by letter to Aunt Elizabeth how fortunately we were situated. So years went by, and it was after the turn of the century, 1900, 1915, and Eliza catches up with one of the other family members. Last name was Eustace, and they did a lot of communicating. And those were some of the letters that I got to read from the Fiddyment letters, because they had kept them all those years. The other thing, a lot of people try to say that Keseberg really wasn't the big cannibal that McGlashan and other people tried to make him out to be. Well, I can tell you, in my book, I copied the letters, a lot of them, and I have them in here. This is my book. You can get it on Amazon or at Barnes & Noble. Keseberg actually tried to take one of the little girls, and it was Eliza, and she was just 4 years old, and her sister stopped him from doing it, and he did indeed turn away. And Eliza's sister accused him. She said, all you want to do is kill her and eat her. I mean, she was real blunt with him. And so she called him on it, and she saved her little sister's life. And that is in a letter. So that's a true story that has a source to it. Okay, so where a lot of these quotes came from is a book that David gave me, The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate, and it was written in 1911. So she puts this book together, and it is the perspective of a child survivor, and she was 4 years old when she came out of the mountain. And her memories are pretty vivid, and she writes with a child's quiet sorrow. The great white storm came and sealed the passes behind us, and there was no going forward and there was no going back. They were stuck at Alder Creek. So about the camps and the endless snow, I just love the words of a child, or she's recalling. The snow lay deep and the trees were heavy laden. Each day the world seemed quieter and heavier. About the hunger and deprivation, of course their food quickly ran out, but Eliza shares they gave us the last of everything. And then they just tried to make us believe that it was enough. So they kept their spirits up as best they could, and Tamsin did that. And she does acknowledge that eventually there was cannibalism, but she doesn't dwell on it because she wasn't aware of it at the time. I was too young to know, and they tried to keep it from us. So the hardest part, of course, was separating from her parents. Of course, her father, George Donner, was too weak to travel, and Tamsin stayed with him. She says, I cried for Mama. I didn't want to go with the strangers. I did not know it would be the last time I saw her. So loss and survival, I think this is probably the most poignant part of everything. Many in Eliza's extended family died, and she and two sisters survived. They were orphaned, and her memoir is filled with so much. But what she says is, the world only knows the horror. I remember the love and the courage. We're going to end on a lighter note. In 1847, so Virginia Reed was 13 or 14, and she writes a few years later, in a letter to her cousin planning to travel to California, we have left everything, but I don't care for that. We have got through with our lives. Don't let this letter dishearten anybody. Remember, never take no cutoffs, and hurry along as fast as you can. And there we have it. So I tried to keep that as light as possible. When I don't like to give this presentation that frequently because it is so emotional. But David Fiddyment felt that it was important that we knew the human aspect of it, and we knew the children's aspect of it, and he spoke about that frequently. We lost David a couple of years ago, just shy of his 1 month shy of his 100th birthday. It was absolutely my honor and my pleasure to write their history of Fiddyment's in Roseville, and I do have a chapter in there dedicated to the Donners. It's an interesting story, and like I said, so many historians have just taken it apart. I don't know of any others who give it like this, a presentation like this. I prefer this one over the other ones. I just think it makes it more human. If you have any questions, let me know. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them, but I'll do my best, or I'll refer you to the right place.
And
Yes?
repeat the question so it can be heard.
Okay, that's right. I forgot. I'm on tape. Yes?
What was the age between Eliza and Georgia? If you know that.
Eliza and Georgia. Well, let's go back to the source here because I have their ages when they took off. Let's see, we have this one and we have this one. So Eliza was 3 when they started, and Georgia was 4, and Frances was 6. Yes?
How famous is it that they were the great nieces or nephews or something? But how does that fit into the Donners or the Donner party?
So the question was, with the Fiddyments, how do they fit into the Donner Party? Well, it's David Fiddyment, the gentleman who I wrote the book with, and David's great aunt was Tamsin Donner. Okay, so, maternal. It was a maternal line. It was through the Eustace and the Bond. It was Bond, it was Eustace, and then Wheelwright. Wheelwright was the family name back there. Yes?
Is there anything that you could go a little bit more in depth about the rescue effort that you found fascinating?
Well, that is a whole different story. And I actually have a recommendation for your group. There's a group or an organization called History Expeditions, and they're out of Placer County. You've heard of them. And they have actually recreated the Forlorn Hope. These are a group of 5 extraordinary endurance athletes, and they studied and researched, and they figured out the path, and they figured out where the Forlorn Hope was when they stopped and settled, and some people died. They got cadaver dogs to make sure they were in the right place. They give a fascinating presentation, and the Forlorn Hope is the one you want to know about because that one was the one that ultimately got them saved. So I can make that recommendation to Kay, and maybe we can get them out here for you guys. And they do a really great presentation. They have audio, visual, and film, and all that kind of stuff. Yes?
So I have a question and a statement. So the first question, I saw one of the early slides, they spelled Donner, D-O-N-N-O-R. I haven't seen that before.
That was because that was probably a typo.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, curious about that. But,
Thank you. I'll look for that.
I myself just drove over what's the old Lincoln Highway, which went over the Verde Peak, which parallels some of the Donner routes. We took a 4x4 over that about a month ago. So I think we're very close to where some of this was, and I find it fascinating that we're talking about this now.
Absolutely. That's great that you did that, and we're exploring more and more.
The reservoirs, the Prosser Reservoir and the other reservoir is what Alder Creek and the other creek turned into eventually.
Yes. Yeah. Good for you. Good historians you guys are. I love historians.
We're getting older, you can't do much of this.
Well, we have to keep our history. It's our foundation. Did somebody up here have a question? No? Yes.
What happened to all the Donner children?
Well, I actually have notes here with all the Donner children. They went on, they married, they had children. The young lady who married Perry McCoon that I mentioned earlier, she was 14, 15 when she married him. He was quite abusive. And, interesting side story, he was known to be abusive. And nobody liked him. And he was in an accident, kind of a rodeo type of situation, and called a rodeo back then. And he was knocked out. Everybody thought, seems to be dead. Threw him in a coffin, threw him in the ground. Well, somebody decided to exhume him a little while later, for whatever reason, and there are scratch marks on the top of that coffin. So you've heard of the bell ringer, right? You put a string in the coffin, the bell on the top. If they're still alive, they're ringing the bell. That actually happened with Perry McCoon. And she went on and remarried. But they all remarried and had good lives. When they built the Donner Monument up at Donner Lake at the Visitor Center, a lot of the descendants went. And there's pictures of them. And it's they're still around. Questions? Any more questions? Well, thank you so much, you guys. This has been my pleasure. I really appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Christina. All right. Well, that was a very, very interesting. I'm going to turn the lights up a little bit so you can stay awake because I have an important announcements. The first thing I want everybody to be aware of before you leave, we have our big charity events of the year for the museum. And that is